Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
I used to think he left because he was confused or emotionally unavailable. That would have been easier to accept. But one night, after replaying every conversation in my head, I noticed something terrifying. He didn't start pulling away when I became needy. He pulled away right after I became powerful. Right after I stopped chasing. Right after I started glowing differently. Right after I no longer needed his validation to breathe. And that realization changes everything. What if some men don't run from weakness? What if they run from the version of you that forces them to confront themselves? Not your sadness, your power. Not your attachment, your awakening. And if you've ever felt someone love you deeply, then suddenly disappear the moment you finally found yourself. This video might explain the heartbreak nobody could put into words. I used to think men pulled away because they stopped caring. That was the explanation I gave myself for years. Simple, clean, easier to survive. He lost feelings. He got scared of commitment. He just wasn't ready. But looking back now, I can admit something far more unsettling. His energy didn't change when I became emotional. It changed when I became emotionally steady. And once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. At first, the shift was subtle. There was no dramatic argument, no betrayal, no final conversation with tears running down both our faces. It was quieter than that. The kind of quiet that slowly fills a room until you realize you can't breathe inside it anymore. I remember one night specifically. We were sitting in the car after dinner, music low, streetlights passing across his face while he drove. I had actually been in a good mood that night, calm, light. I wasn't anxiously checking whether he sounded distant. I wasn't trying to decode his tone. I wasn't reaching for reassurance every 5 minutes. For the first time in a long time, I just existed beside him peacefully. And strangely, he felt further away than ever. I noticed it in the way he stopped reaching for my hand first, in the pauses between his sentences, in the way he looked at the road a little too long whenever the conversation became emotionally real. At the time, I thought I was imagining it. But later, much later, I realized something painful. Some people feel safest when you are uncertain about yourself. Not consciously, not maliciously, but the dynamic works better for them that way. When you're over-explaining, over-giving, seeking reassurance, trying to earn love, there's a role they get to play inside that version of you. The protector, the rescuer, the emotionally desired one. But the moment your energy settles into itself, something changes. And I think that's the part nobody talks about enough in these connections. Sometimes your healing disrupts the relationship more than your brokenness ever did. Pause for a second and really think about that. Why did things feel stable when you were anxious, but unstable once you became calm? Why did he seem more affectionate when you were afraid of losing him, but emotionally distant once you stopped chasing? That contradiction can drive a person insane. I remember staring at my phone some nights, rereading old conversations, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted. And eventually I found it. It wasn't after a fight. It wasn't after I became too emotional. It happened right after I started coming back to myself. Right after I stopped panicking every time he needed space. Right after I started sleeping better again. Right after my entire nervous system stopped revolving around whether he texted me back. That was the moment the distance began. And honestly, admitting that hurt more than the separation itself, because it forced me to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the relationship had quietly depended on my insecurity? Not entirely, not intentionally, but enough that my growth changed the emotional chemistry between us. I think a lot of divine feminine energy goes through this exact awakening. You spend so long believing your sensitivity is the problem, your depth, your emotions, your longing. Then one day you realize the connection actually became unstable when you stopped abandoning yourself. That realization is brutal. I remember how differently he looked at me once I became more grounded. It's hard to explain unless you've lived it. The attraction was still there. The feelings were still there. But underneath it there was discomfort. Like he could feel himself losing emotional control over the dynamic. And maybe control isn't even the perfect word. Maybe it was certainty. Before, he knew exactly how important he was to my emotional world. He could feel it. But once I became more centered, more connected to myself, less emotionally dependent on his validation, he could feel that too. People sense energy shifts long before words are spoken, especially in intimate connections. You don't need to announce your independence. Your nervous system communicates it for you. The way you respond changes. The way you wait changes. The silence changes. Even your eyes change. I remember him looking at me one evening with this strange expression I couldn't understand at the time. Almost like admiration mixed with distance. Like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, and it unsettled him. That moment stayed with me. Because deep down, I think he realized I no longer needed him in the same desperate way. And for some people, that feels terrifying. Not because they don't love you, but because your wholeness forces them to confront themselves, their emotional patterns, their avoidance, their dependency on being needed. Your growth becomes a mirror they didn't expect to look into. And mirrors can feel threatening when someone has spent years avoiding their own reflection. I know that's difficult to hear. Part of me resisted this realization for a long time because I didn't want to turn him into the villain. And honestly, I don't think he was. I think he cared deeply. But caring deeply and being emotionally ready are not always the same thing. Some people can love your light until it stops revolving around them. That's the painful nuance nobody prepares you for. I used to think love meant staying emotionally attached at all costs. Constant contact, constant reassurance, constant emotional fusion. But healthy energy feels different. Quieter, steadier, less desperate. And ironically, sometimes that emotional steadiness exposes cracks that chaos had been hiding. I started noticing little things after that. He took longer to reply. Not dramatically, just enough to feel it. Conversations became more surface level. When I spoke confidently about my future, he seemed distracted. When I stopped asking for reassurance, he stopped offering it. That one really stayed with me, because it revealed something subtle but important. Some connections unconsciously survive through emotional imbalance. One person seeks, the other reassures. One person fears abandonment, the other feels emotionally important. But once the seeking energy disappears, both people are forced to face what remains underneath. Real intimacy, real vulnerability, real self-awareness. And not everyone is prepared for that level of emotional exposure. I think that's why these separations feel so confusing. You become healthier and suddenly the relationship struggles. You become calmer and suddenly they become distant. You stop chasing and suddenly they pull away further. It makes no logical sense at first, until you realize your transformation changed the emotional contract between you. And maybe the hardest part of all is grieving someone who seemed more comfortable with your wounds than your power. That grief is complicated, quiet, embarrassingly invisible. No one sees the heartbreak of realizing your healing changed the relationship dynamic. No one sees the confusion of becoming stronger while simultaneously feeling abandoned. I remember sitting alone one night after one of our conversations ended early. The room was silent except for the sound of the ceiling fan turning above me. And for the first time, I stopped blaming myself completely. Not in an angry way. Not in a bitter way. Just honestly. I finally admitted. Maybe I wasn't too much. Maybe I had simply stopped being emotionally small. And maybe that changed everything. The strange thing is, once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. How some people lean in when you're broken, but drift when you become powerful. How your confidence can accidentally expose another person's emotional limitations. How healing sometimes rearranges relationships more painfully than conflict ever could. And still part of you keeps asking the same aching question. If he truly loved me, why couldn't he stay? Maybe we'll answer that together. But first, we have to talk about the role you unknowingly played in his emotional world. Because sometimes the connection wasn't built only on love. Sometimes it was also built on being needed. And the moment you stopped needing rescue, the entire dynamic began to shake. Sometimes people don't leave when you become hard to love. They leave when you become hard to control emotionally. I didn't realize how much of our connection was built around him rescuing me until I stopped needing to be rescued. That sentence alone took me years to admit. Not because it made him a bad person, and not because I was pretending to be weak. It was subtler than that. At the beginning, I genuinely was struggling emotionally. Confused, open, searching for stability. And he entered my life during a season where his presence felt grounding. He knew how to calm me down, how to reassure me, how to pull me out of emotional spirals with just a few words. And honestly, there's something deeply intimate about being emotionally saved by someone during a vulnerable period in your life. You start associating their presence with safety. Their attention becomes medicine. Their validation becomes relief. Their affection becomes regulation for your nervous system. That's why these connections feel so consuming. You're not just attached to the person. You become attached to how they make your body feel. The calm after panic. The warmth after abandonment. The feeling of finally being chosen. And for a while, he seemed to love being that person for me. He liked fixing things. Liked being the one I called when life overwhelmed me. Liked being the stable one while I was still emotionally unraveling. I think it gave him purpose inside the relationship. A clear role. The protector. The guide. The emotionally needed one. But relationships quietly change when healing begins. And healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's tiny. You cry less often. You stop over-explaining your feelings. You stop asking, "Are you okay?" every 5 minutes after sensing a slight shift in their tone. You begin holding yourself emotionally. At first, I thought that growth would make the relationship stronger. Wouldn't it? I mean, isn't that what people say they want? A healed woman. A confident woman. A grounded feminine energy. But what nobody tells you is this. Some people love your healing in theory until they experience how it changes the dynamic in reality. That's where things started shifting between us. Not all at once. Slowly. Quietly. Like two people standing in the same room while the emotional temperature changes degree by degree. I remember one particular conversation. I had just shared something exciting about my future, a new opportunity, a new version of myself I was beginning to feel connected to. I was speaking with certainty for once, not seeking approval, not asking permission, just expressing myself openly. And instead of leaning closer emotionally, he became strangely distant, not rude, not cold, just quieter. The energy dropped. At the time, I ignored it, but later, I realized something uncomfortable. My expansion disrupted the version of me he had grown comfortable understanding. That realization hurt in ways I can't fully describe. Because you want to believe love grows naturally alongside your evolution. But sometimes people unconsciously connect to the version of you that needed them most. And once that version disappears, they don't know who they are inside the relationship anymore. I think this happens far more often than people admit, especially in intense spiritual or emotional connections. A man can genuinely adore your softness while still struggling with your sovereignty. He can admire your strength intellectually while emotionally fearing what it means for him. Pause there for a second. That contradiction matters. Because many women blame themselves when a man withdraws during their glow-up season. They think, I became too independent. I became too focused on myself. I became harder to love. But sometimes the deeper reality is this. Your growth removed the emotional role he unconsciously depended on. And without that role, his identity inside the connection began collapsing. I remember how subtle the signs were. He stopped asking deeper questions. Stopped engaging with my emotional evolution the way he used to. When I was struggling, he could talk to me for hours. But when I became more empowered, more emotionally clear, the conversations shortened. It felt confusing. Why did he seem more emotionally present during my pain than during my peace? That question haunted me for months. And eventually I realized something difficult. Some people feel most connected to you when they are needed by you, not when they are simply beside you. That's an entirely different kind of intimacy. Real partnership requires to hold people standing face to face without one needing to emotionally carry the other. And that kind of connection can feel terrifying for someone who built self-worth around being indispensable. I don't think he consciously knew this. Honestly, I don't think most people do. Human beings are rarely aware of the emotional contracts they create unconsciously, especially in relationships. One person becomes the caretaker. The other becomes the seeker. One becomes emotionally dependent. The other becomes emotionally central. But healing rearranges those roles. And when the roles disappear, the hidden insecurities underneath finally surface. I started noticing moments where he seemed uncomfortable with my confidence. Not openly threatened, just unsettled. Like he couldn't fully locate himself anymore. When I stopped spiraling emotionally, he had less opportunity to soothe me. When I stopped doubting myself constantly, his reassurance mattered less. When I became emotionally grounded, he could no longer define himself through rescuing me. That changes the chemistry of a connection more than people realize. And strangely, that's often when emotional distance begins. I remember sitting across from him one evening while he joked around casually, avoiding deeper conversation entirely. Months earlier, we could talk for hours about fears, dreams, pain, healing. Now, there was this invisible wall. Not hatred, not indifference, avoidance. Like emotional depth had become uncomfortable now that I was no longer emotionally dependent on him. And I think part of him could feel the shift before I fully understood it myself. People sense when your energy becomes self-contained. Your eyes stop searching for reassurance. Your body language changes. Your silence changes. There's less desperation in your presence. And ironically, that can activate insecurity in someone who once felt emotionally essential to your world. I know some people listening to this will immediately think, so are you saying women should stay small to keep love? No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is far more painful. Sometimes growth reveals whether the connection was rooted in mutual evolution or emotional dependency. And those are not the same thing. Dependency can feel incredibly intense, addictive even. But true intimacy requires both people to evolve. Not just one person carrying the emotional transformation while the other stays emotionally safe. I think that's why these separations feel so personal. You don't just lose the person. You lose the emotional role you both unconsciously played for each other. And when those roles dissolve, grief gets complicated. I remember the strange loneliness of becoming stronger while simultaneously feeling less emotionally chosen. That contradiction broke my heart. You imagine healing will automatically attract deeper love. But sometimes healing first exposes relationships that were unconsciously built around imbalance. And once that imbalance disappears, both people are forced to confront themselves honestly. I think part of him truly did admire my evolution. I saw it in flashes. The way he looked at me sometimes. The pride in his voice when talking about me to other people. But admiration and emotional readiness are not always the same thing. Someone can be inspired by your growth and still feel destabilized by it internally, especially if your evolution silently highlights the places where they have remained stagnant. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Your light can unintentionally confront someone's avoidance. Your healing can expose their emotional immaturity. Your self-respect can reveal where they still abandon themselves. And not everyone can sit comfortably inside that mirror. Some people lean away from it. Slowly. Quietly. Until one day you realize you're no longer standing inside the same emotional reality together. I remember the grief of recognizing that he loved being important to me, but struggled with who I became once I no longer needed saving. That realization felt devastating, not because it erased the love, but because it changed how I understood the connection itself. And maybe that's what awakening actually is. Not losing illusions about love entirely, but finally seeing the hidden dynamics underneath it. The roles, the wounds, the emotional dependencies, all the invisible things operating beneath chemistry. Still, even after realizing all this, part of me kept wondering, if he truly loved me, why couldn't he grow with me? Maybe the answer isn't as simple as fear. Maybe some people meet your soul before they're ready to meet themselves. And when that happens, they often pull away the moment your evolution stops allowing them to hide. Growth changes relationship chemistry. Not everyone can recognize you once you stop shrinking. I didn't notice the moment it happened. That's the strange part. There was no announcement inside me that said, "You are no longer chasing." No clear emotional turning point where everything suddenly made sense. It was quieter than that. Almost invisible. Like waking up one morning and realizing the air in your room feels slightly different, but you can't explain why. I used to think emotional change had to be loud to matter. Big decisions, conversations, declarations. But this wasn't like that. This was internal, slow, almost biological. My nervous system started to let go of him. Not because I forced it, not because I was trying to be strong, but because something inside me finally got tired of the constant emotional vigilance. I stopped checking my phone with that familiar tightness in my chest. That subtle expectation before unlocking the screen. That microsecond of hope. That quiet disappointment when it wasn't him. That entire cycle started to dissolve. And I didn't even realize it at first. I remember one afternoon very clearly. I was sitting near a window, scrolling through something completely unrelated to him. The sun was warm on my skin. I wasn't thinking about what he was doing. I wasn't calculating response times or analyzing tone shifts from previous conversations. And then it hit me. I hadn't checked my phone in over 2 hours. 2 hours. That might sound small from the outside, but inside me, it felt like an earthquake. Because I had been living in emotional anticipation for so long, the absence used to feel unsafe. But in that moment, there was no panic, just stillness. And I didn't know it yet, but that stillness was the beginning of something irreversible. What I didn't realize at the time is that detachment doesn't stay invisible for long in deep emotional connections, especially the kind where two nervous systems have been entangled for a long time. Because even if nothing is said, it is always felt. He felt it before I ever said anything. I know that now. At first, it showed up in subtle shifts. He started replying a little slower. Not dramatically, not enough to accuse, not enough to create a clear conflict. Just enough for me to notice if I was still in that old version of myself. But I wasn't. Or at least I was beginning not to be. And that's what made everything feel different. There's something almost unsettling about the moment you stop chasing someone emotionally. Not in a performative way, not as a strategy, but in a genuine internal shift where your attention simply stops orbiting them the same way. You don't wait as intensely. You don't interpret every silence as danger. You don't feel the need to repair distance instantly. And the irony is that's often when the dynamic starts to shift. Because the nervous system that used to be actively engaged in pursuit suddenly becomes quiet. And silence in emotional systems is never neutral. It's noticeable. I remember one conversation we had during that period. We were talking casually, nothing deep, nothing emotional on the surface. But I noticed something strange. I wasn't over-explaining myself anymore. I wasn't carefully crafting my words to maintain connection. I wasn't scanning his reactions while I spoke. I was just there, present, and strangely detached from the outcome. He paused more during that conversation, not because anything was wrong, but because something had changed in the rhythm between us. It was like he was trying to locate something familiar in me and not fully finding it. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it, but I wasn't. People don't need words to sense when your emotional dependency shifts. They feel it in how you pause, in how you respond, in how you no longer reach for them energetically after silence. Even your waiting changes, and waiting is louder than words in intimate connections. There was another moment I still remember vividly. We were sitting together, not doing anything particularly meaningful, just sharing space. At one point, he looked at me and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A hesitation. Not confusion exactly. More like recalibration. As if he was adjusting to a version of me that no longer mirrored his emotional expectations. I didn't cling to the moment. I didn't analyze it in real time. But later, I understood what was happening. He could feel I was no longer emotionally reaching for him in the same way. And that changes the entire internal structure of a connection. Because when someone stops reaching, the other person suddenly becomes aware of space. And space in emotional dynamics is not empty. It is revealing. It shows what was always there underneath the movement. I think this is something most people misunderstand about detachment. They assume it is coldness or indifference. But real detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of urgency. And urgency is what often fuels emotional intensity in relationships that are not yet fully balanced. I didn't become indifferent to him. Not at all. But I stopped feeling like I needed him in order to stabilize myself internally. And that subtle shift changed everything. I remember one night lying in bed after we had spoken briefly earlier that day. Normally, I would replay the conversation in my head, analyzing tone, searching for meaning, trying to decode emotional subtext. But that night I didn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, not emotionally spiraling, not trying to fix anything. And there was a strange emptiness in that stillness. Not painful, just unfamiliar. Like my system didn't know what to do without the emotional noise it had been trained to expect. That's when I started realizing something deeper. Detachment doesn't always feel like peace at first. Sometimes it feels like loss of identity, because so much of who we think we are inside relationships is built around emotional engagement patterns. The thinking, the reacting, the longing, the interpreting. When those patterns fade, there's silence where identity used to be active. And that silence can feel like emotional vertigo. But underneath it, something else is forming. Something quieter, more stable, more self-contained. And I think he sensed that before I fully understood it myself. Because round that time, something in his energy shifted too. He became less predictable. Sometimes more present, sometimes more distant. Like he was responding to something he couldn't quite name. But what he was responding to was me no longer unconsciously chasing. I started noticing moments where he would reach out unexpectedly. Not necessarily emotionally deep messages, but small attempts to re-establish connection. A check-in, a casual question, a sudden memory from the past. And I remember feeling something strange when those messages came. Not excitement, not panic, just awareness. Like I was observing the old rhythm from a slightly higher place within myself. And I think that's when I realized the shift wasn't just emotional. It was structural. The dynamic itself was reorganizing. Because when one person stops chasing, the entire system heads to relevance. But relevance is not always comfortable for the person who was used to being emotionally central. I want to be honest here. Part of me still missed the old intensity, the emotional highs, the longing, the feeling of deep attachment, even though it was painful, even though it was unstable. There is something addictive about emotional urgency. It makes you feel alive in a very specific way. But that aliveness often comes from instability, not connection. And I was slowly starting to see the difference. There was a night I sat alone and realized something I didn't want to admit. I wasn't as emotionally available to him anymore, but I wasn't trying to be. It was happening naturally. And that scared me a little, because it meant I was changing in a way I couldn't reverse. Not toward him, but toward myself. And in that space, something unexpected began to emerge. Clarity. Not dramatic clarity. Not spiritual revelation. Just a quiet knowing that I was no longer the same emotional person I had been at the beginning of this connection. And if I wasn't that person anymore, then the relationship couldn't remain the same either. That realization didn't bring relief immediately. It brought distance, but not just between us, between who I was and who I was becoming. And I think that's what he felt, even if he couldn't explain it, even if he didn't have words for it. He felt the shift before I did, and maybe that's why things began to feel like they were slowly slipping out of alignment. Not because love disappeared, but because the emotional gravity between us changed. And once gravity changes, nothing stays in the same place. Your detachment is not invisible. It is felt long before it is understood. I remember the exact moment I started feeling it, even though I didn't have words for it yet. It wasn't something he said. It was something in the silence between us. The kind of silence that used to feel comfortable but slowly began to feel like something was being avoided. Not avoided in an obvious way. Not like running out of a room or ending a conversation abruptly. It was subtler. Like emotional distance being carefully maintained while still pretending everything was normal. And that's what made it confusing. Because on the surface, nothing had broken. We still talked. We still laughed sometimes. We still shared small parts of our day. But underneath it, something had shifted. And I could feel it in my body before I could explain it in my mind. A tightening in my chest when conversations ended too quickly. A slight pause before he replied that felt longer than necessary. The way my nervous system stopped relaxing around his presence. I used to feel regulated by him. Now I felt aware. Too aware. As if something unspoken was sitting in the space between us, waiting to be acknowledged, but never fully allowed into the conversation. Looking back now, I understand what that something was. It was me changing. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet way a person begins to return to themselves after years of emotional outsourcing. I wasn't performing my emotions anymore. I wasn't over-explaining my feelings just to be understood. I wasn't bending my truth into something more digestible for him. I was just being. And strangely, that presence created tension. Not conflict, not argument. Tension. Because presence without emotional dependency is something a lot of people are not prepared for inside intimate connections. Especially when the relationship was previously built on emotional polarity. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had started embodying something he wasn't used to from me. Stillness. And stillness can be confronting. When I used to spiral emotionally, he had a clear role. He could calm me down, reassure me, stabilize the situation. There was structure in that dynamic, a predictable emotional rhythm. But when I stopped spiraling, that role disappeared. And I think that's when something deeper in him started reacting. Not consciously, more like instinctively. Because when someone no longer needs you in the way they used to, you are forced to face what you actually are in their emotional world. Not the role, not the identity, just you. I remember one evening sitting across from him while he talked about something unrelated. His voice was steady, familiar, normal. But I wasn't fully inside the conversation anymore. I was observing something else. The space. The distance, the subtle emotional disconnect that didn't exist in words, but existed in energy. At one point, he looked at me and smiled slightly, and I noticed something strange. He wasn't fully meeting my eyes the way he used to, not because he was distracted, but because eye contact suddenly felt heavier, like it carried more information than he was ready to process. And in that moment, something clicked inside me, not as a thought, as a feeling. He could feel me seeing him differently, not rejecting him, not judging him, but seeing him without the emotional filter I used to have. And that can be unsettling for someone who is used to being seen through need. There is a kind of emotional safety that comes from being someone's anchor. You feel important, needed, stable in their world. But when that person begins to stabilize themselves, you are no longer their emotional center. You become just a person. And I think that transition is where a lot of confusion begins in these connections. Because he didn't do anything differently at first, but he started feeling differently. He became quieter in moments that used to feel intimate, more reserved when conversations went deeper, slightly more distant after emotional exchanges that used to bring us closer. And I could feel myself trying briefly to understand what I had done wrong. But the truth was I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply become less emotionally dependent. And that shift changed everything. What I didn't understand at the time was that my emotional growth wasn't just personal healing. It was also relational disruption. Because when one person changes the emotional pattern of a connection, the other person is forced to adapt, or resist, or retreat. And I think he was doing something in between all three. There were moments when he reached for me emotionally, small ones. A joke that carried a little too much nostalgia. A message sent late at night that felt slightly more personal than usual. A brief attempt to re-enter emotional closeness. But then, just as quickly he would pull back again. Like approaching something warm and unfamiliar, then stepping away before getting too close. At the time, I thought it was inconsistency. But now I see it differently. I think he was reacting to the version of me he could no longer fully access. The version that needed him. The version that softened everything around him emotionally. The version that made him feel central without effort. And when that version started disappearing, he didn't know how to relate to what remained. There's something no one really prepares you for in deep emotional bonds like this. When you grow, you don't just lose emotional patterns. You also lose emotional familiarity. And familiarity is often what people unconsciously attach to. Not just love, not just chemistry, but the feeling of knowing how to exist inside someone else's emotional world. And I had changed the world without realizing it. I remember one moment that still stays with me. We were talking, and I shared something I used to be very vulnerable about. But this time, I shared it differently. Not from pain, not from confusion, from clarity. And I saw it in his face. A subtle shift. Not rejection, not disinterest, but recalibration. Like something in him was trying to adjust to a version of me that no longer needed emotional rescue. And for a split second, I saw something deeper behind his expression. Not anger, not frustration. Something quieter, almost like discomfort. Because my clarity was reflecting something back to him. Something he hadn't fully addressed in himself. And I think that's the part that hurt the most for both of us. Not the separation itself, but what it revealed. When someone becomes emotionally steady in a dynamic where they used to be unstable, it doesn't just change how they are seen. It changes how the other person sees themselves. And that can be difficult to sit with. I started noticing more of those micro moments. Silences that lasted just a little longer than before. Conversations that didn't deepen the way they used to. A subtle emotional hesitance that wasn't there previously. And I would catch myself wondering, is this distance or awareness? Is he pulling away, or is he reacting to something he can feel but cannot name? Because I could feel it too. The invisible tension. The shift in emotional gravity. It was like standing in a room where the air pressure had changed, but nothing visible had moved. And maybe that's what made it so emotionally confusing. Nothing looked broken, but everything felt different. I didn't know it then, but I was witnessing something very specific. The moment when emotional dependency begins to dissolve and mutual awareness begins to replace it. And not everyone is comfortable in that transition. Because emotional dependency creates rules, and rules create predictability. But awareness removes rules, and leaves to people just facing each other, without the emotional scripts they used to rely on. That's where things get real, and sometimes too real for people who were never prepared for it. I think he felt that, even if he never said it, even if he never consciously understood it. He felt that I was no longer the emotional version of myself that made the dynamic effortless for him. And in that absence, something in him had to face itself. Not me. Himself. And I think that's why distance began to form. Not because love disappeared, but because the mirror became too clear. Sometimes your presence becomes a mirror, and not everyone is ready to see themselves without distortion. I didn't notice when I stopped being easy for him to be around. Not easy in the way people usually think, not about effort, not about personality, not about conflict. It was something more subtle than that. I became emotionally self-contained. And for someone who was used to feeling emotionally central in my world, that changed everything. At first, I thought I was just healing, just growing, just learning how to stand on my own without constantly reaching for reassurance. But what I didn't understand yet was this. My healing wasn't just changing me. It was changing what I reflected back to him. And that reflection wasn't always comfortable. There's a moment in certain connections where admiration turns into quiet discomfort. Not because anything is wrong, but because presence becomes too honest. I remember one afternoon sitting alone, thinking about how differently he had started responding to me. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to and say, this is where it changed. It was more like a temperature shift. Subtle, consistent, undeniable over time. He still showed up. He still replied. He still engaged. But something had been removed from the space between us. A kind of emotional ease. And I kept asking myself why. Why does connection feel harder now that I am more grounded? Why does clarity feel like distance? Why does peace feel like loss? And I didn't realize it then, but I was no longer just interacting with him. I was interacting with what I had become in his perception. Because when you grow, you don't only change your internal world. You also change the emotional memory someone has of you. And that memory doesn't always update at the same speed as your healing. I think he still remembered me as the version who needed him. The version who reached out emotionally first. The version who softened the space between us with longing. And when that version started fading, something in him didn't have a clear place to land. There were moments where I could feel it very clearly. We would talk, and I would express something grounded, certain, self-aware. And instead of deepening the conversation, it would plateau. Like we reached a ceiling neither of us knew how to break through. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the dynamic itself had shifted. I wasn't pulling him into emotional intimacy the same way anymore. And he wasn't stepping forward to meet me in that new space either. It felt like standing on opposite sides of a bridge that used to feel connected in the middle, but now had a gap neither of us acknowledged out loud. And the strangest part, I wasn't trying to pull him closer anymore. That urge, the anxious reaching, the emotional chasing, it had started dissolving. Not all at once, but in layers. Slowly, my nervous system stopped interpreting distance as danger. And that alone changed everything. Because when you stop reacting emotionally, you stop feeding the old structure of the relationship. And what remains is something unfamiliar. Something quieter. Less dramatic. But more revealing. I remember one night scrolling through my thoughts instead of my phone. That's how I can describe it now. I wasn't checking for him. I wasn't waiting for him. I was just observing myself. And I realized something that startled me. I wasn't performing anymore. Not for him. Not for connection. Not for emotional stability. I was just existing in my own emotional field. And somewhere inside that shift, I think I became harder for him to place emotionally. Because I wasn't reinforcing the role he used to hold. There is something deeply human about needing to feel important in someone's emotional world. It gives structure. It gives meaning. It gives identity. And when that structure weakens, people don't always respond with clarity. Sometimes they respond with withdrawal. Sometimes confusion. Sometimes silence. I started noticing how he reacted when I spoke about my growth. Not directly rejecting it, but not fully entering it either. Like he was observing a version of me that he hadn't emotionally adapted to yet. There was one conversation that stayed with me. I mentioned something I had been working on internally, something personal, something reflective. And I expected him, in some old part of my mind, to respond with curiosity, or emotional engagement, or even recognition. But instead there was a pause, a small one, almost unnoticeable if I hadn't been so attuned to the emotional rhythm between us. And then he responded in a lighter tone, deflecting slightly, not dismissing, but not meeting me either. And I remember sitting there thinking, why does it feel like I'm speaking from a different version of myself than the one he remembers? And that question lingered. because it pointed to something deeper. When you evolve internally, you don't always evolve relationally at the same pace as the other person. And sometimes they're still interacting with a memory of you that no longer exists in the same form. But what I didn't fully understand yet was this. My evolution wasn't just changing how I saw myself. It was changing how he saw himself inside the dynamic. Because I was no longer unconsciously reinforcing his emotional importance in my world. And when that shifts, people feel it. Even if they can't explain it. Even if they don't consciously recognize it. They feel when their emotional place in someone's life is no longer the same. And that can be destabilizing. Not because they don't care, but because identity inside relationships is often built through repetition, through roles, through emotional feedback loops. And I had quietly stepped out of the loop. There were moments when I could almost see him trying to find the old version of me again. Not intentionally, but in small ways. Bringing up past memories, referencing old emotional moments, subtly reaching for familiarity, as if trying to reconnect with a version of the dynamic that felt more understandable. And I would feel something complicated in those moments, a mix of tenderness and distance, because part of me still remembered that version of us, and another part of me knew I couldn't go back to it. Not emotionally, not energetically, not without abandoning what I had just started to build inside myself. And that is where the internal conflict lived. You don't just outgrow a person. Sometimes you outgrow the emotional architecture of the connection itself. And that creates a kind of invisible grief. Because nothing is officially lost, but nothing feels the same either. I think that's when I started realizing something uncomfortable. My presence was no longer fitting into the emotional shape he was used to. And instead of reshaping with me, there was hesitation, distance, quiet recalibration, like standing too close to something that has changed temperature without warning. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity in emotional bonds can feel like loss even when nothing has ended. There were nights I would sit with that realization and feel a strange contradiction inside me. On one hand, I felt more myself than ever. More grounded, more aware, less emotionally dependent. But on the other hand, I felt a kind of quiet loneliness I couldn't fully explain. Because the version of connection I had known no longer existed. And the new version hadn't fully formed yet. It was in that in-between space where confusion lives. Where you are no longer who you were, but not yet fully settled into who you are becoming. And I think he was feeling that too. Just from the other side. Because when one person evolves, the emotional symmetry breaks. And someone has to adjust, or retreat, or reevaluate what the connection now means. And in his case, I could feel the hesitation growing. Not rejection, not indifference, something more subtle, a distance created by recognition. Because I had become a reminder of something he couldn't fully meet anymore. Not because I was asking for more, but because I was no longer asking for less. And that changed everything. Sometimes your growth doesn't push people away directly, it simply reveals the emotional gap they were never prepared to bridge. I used to believe separation meant something had gone wrong. That if someone truly cared, truly felt the connection, they would stay. They would fight through the confusion. They would bridge the distance. They would choose closeness even when it felt uncomfortable. But what I didn't understand then was something far more complicated. Sometimes separation isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of pressure, not punishment, not rejection, not abandonment in the way we emotionally interpret it. Pressure, the kind that builds silently underneath both people until something inside finally has to give. I didn't see it that way at first. In the beginning, I framed everything through loss. I was the one left behind emotionally, the one who replayed conversations at night, the one who felt the absence in ordinary moments, coffee mornings, quiet evenings, random thoughts that used to belong to us. And it felt personal, painfully personal, like I had been removed from something I still believed I belonged to. But over time, something started shifting in how I perceived it. Not because the pain disappeared, but because I began to see the pattern underneath it. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. It was more like a slow unraveling of emotional structure that neither of us fully controlled. And I think that's what makes these connections so disorienting. Because nothing dramatic has to happen for everything to change. Sometimes it's just internal pressure building into people at the same time in different ways. I remember one evening sitting alone and thinking, why does this feel like I'm growing while losing something at the same time? That contradiction stayed with me. Because logically, growth is supposed to feel like expansion, like clarity, like empowerment. But emotionally, often begins with disorientation, especially when your growth is happening inside a connection that hasn't fully adjusted to who you are becoming. I started noticing something subtle. The more emotionally stable I became, the more unstable the dynamic felt. Not in an explosive way, in a quiet way. Like something was slowly losing synchronization. Texts became less emotionally charged. Conversations became more functional. Silences became longer, heavier, harder to interpret. And I found myself wondering if I was imagining it. But my body knew. That's the thing people don't talk about enough. Your nervous system recognizes relational shifts long before your mind does. There was a particular moment I still remember clearly. We were talking, and I was sharing something meaningful about myself, not from pain, not from confusion, but from a place of self-awareness. And I noticed he wasn't fully entering it with me, not dismissing, not ignoring, just partially present, like he was standing at the edge of the conversation instead of inside it. And I remember feeling a strange internal pause, not sadness immediately, more like recognition. Something is changing here, and neither of us is naming it. What I didn't understand then was that separation often begins long before physical distance appears. It begins in emotional misalignment, in the inability to meet each other at the same internal frequency. And that misalignment creates pressure, because one person is evolving inwardly while the other is adjusting outwardly, and neither fully understands how to meet in the middle anymore. I used to think he was pulling away from me, but now I see it differently. It wasn't just pulling away. It was pressure from within the dynamic itself. Pressure created by my emotional independence increasing and his emotional role in my world decreasing. At the beginning, he had a clear emotional position. He was needed. He was the stabilizer, the responder, the one I turned to when I couldn't regulate myself. That role gave structure to the connection. But when I started regulating myself, that structure dissolved. And without structure, something else emerges. Uncertainty. Not necessarily about love, but about identity inside the relationship. I think that's where the separation truly begins. Not when someone stops caring, but when they stop knowing who they are in your emotional world. I didn't see it in real time. I was too focused on my own healing, too focused on becoming stable, too focused on not falling back into old patterns. But looking back now, I can see how the dynamic was slowly losing its shape. There were moments when he would try to reconnect in small ways. A message that felt slightly more intentional. A conversation that leaned briefly into nostalgia. A moment of emotional openness that came and went quickly. And each time, I could feel both of us trying in different ways to find the version of the connection that used to exist. But it wasn't fully there anymore. because I wasn't fully there anymore. Not in the old way. And neither was he. We were both reacting to a version of each other that no longer matched our internal states. And that mismatch creates pressure. Quiet pressure. Invisible pressure. The kind that doesn't explode outward immediately, but instead reshapes emotional behavior slowly. I remember sitting in silence one night after a short conversation with him. And instead of replaying everything like I used to, I just sat there. Not numb. Not detached. Just aware. And something inside me finally admitted. This is not collapsing because something is wrong. It is collapsing because something is changing. And change doesn't always feel like progress when you're inside it. Sometimes it feels like loss. I think that's why separation in these dynamics feels so painful. Because you're not just losing a person. You're losing the emotional version of reality you used to inhabit with them. And that version of reality shaped how you understood connection, safety, identity. When it dissolves, there's a gap. And the mind rushes to fill the gap with stories. He doesn't care anymore. I wasn't enough. I ruined it. It was never real. But beneath those stories, something more neutral is often happening. Two nervous systems recalibrating out of sync. One expanding inward. One contracting outward. One becoming self-sufficient. The other struggling to find its place inside the new structure. And I think that's what I was experiencing. Not punishment. Not rejection. But pressure created by transformation. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The more I healed, the more unstable the connection felt. The more I stopped needing, the less predictable he became. The more I returned to myself, the more distance quietly formed between us. And for a long time, I interpreted that as something going wrong. But now I see it as something shifting into truth. Because relationships that depend on imbalance cannot remain stable once balance returns. That realization is not easy to sit with. It doesn't give you a clean villain. It doesn't give you a simple ending. It gives you complexity. And complexity is harder to grieve than loss. I remember one night thinking about how strange it is that healing can feel like both liberation and separation at the same time. Like you are becoming more yourself while simultaneously losing access to something familiar. And I think that's where the emotional contradiction lies. You don't want to go back. But part of you misses the intensity of what you left behind. Not the pain, but the connection pattern. The emotional rhythm, the sense of being intertwined. And slowly you start realizing something difficult. What you are grieving is not just the person. It's the version of you that existed in relation to them. And that version cannot exist anymore. Not because love is gone, but because you are no longer the same emotional person inside it. And I think he felt that too. Even if he didn't have words for it. Even if he couldn't articulate it clearly. He felt the shift. He felt the pressure. He felt the structure of the connection changing beneath him. And instead of forcing something unstable to continue, something in the dynamic began to release. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly. Like two people standing in the same space, realizing the air between them is no longer the same as before. And neither of them fully knows what to do with that realization. Sometimes separation is not a collapse of love, but the natural pressure created when two people stop fitting the emotional roles they once unconsciously agreed to play. I used to make myself smaller around him without even realizing it. Not in obvious ways. I still laughed, still cared, still expressed myself, but there were subtle adjustments happening constantly beneath the surface. I softened my opinions when I sensed tension, held back emotional depth when I felt him pulling away, explained things more gently than necessary so he wouldn't feel overwhelmed. And at the time, I called that love, compromise, patience, understanding. But looking back now, I can see something deeper. I was unconsciously managing his emotional comfort at the expense of my full presence. That realization hit me slowly, not all at once, like discovering tiny fractures in glass or staring through it for years believing it was whole. I remember one night very clearly. We were having a conversation that started casually and somehow drifted into something more vulnerable. The room was dim, quiet. There was one of those long pauses between sentences where you can feel the emotional atmosphere changing. And for a moment, I stopped filtering myself. I spoke honestly, not dramatically, not emotionally explosive, just honestly, about what I felt, about the distance I sensed between us, about the strange sadness of loving someone while simultaneously feeling them retreat emotionally. And I remember the look on his face afterward. Not anger, not rejection. Something more complicated, almost like emotional exposure, like he suddenly felt too visible. He looked away quickly after that, changed the subject a few minutes later, and the conversation never fully returned to that emotional depth again. At the time, I blamed myself. I thought maybe I had been too intense, too emotional, too deep, too aware. But now I understand something I couldn't see then. My honesty activated something uncomfortable inside him. Not because honesty is wrong, but because emotional depth forces people to encounter themselves. And not everyone is prepared for that encounter, especially if they've spent years surviving through avoidance. I think many women misunderstand what happens in these connections. They assume a man withdraws because he feels nothing. But sometimes he withdraws because he feels too much and lacks the emotional structure to process it safely. That distinction matters, because one interpretation makes you feel unworthy. The other reveals emotional overwhelm. I didn't realize how powerful emotional presence could be until I saw someone react to it like danger. Not physical danger, emotional danger. The danger of being fully seen. The danger of no longer hiding behind performance, distraction, or emotional distance. And once I understood that, so many moments suddenly made sense. The way he would become quieter after deep conversations. The way intimacy sometimes created closeness one day, then distance the next. The way he occasionally created tension immediately after moments of genuine connection. At first, those contradictions felt cruel, confusing, but now I see them differently. His nervous system associated emotional exposure with vulnerability, and vulnerability felt unsafe. Not because of me specifically, but because true intimacy removes emotional armor. It reveals what someone has avoided within themselves. I remember there were nights where we would connect so deeply it almost felt surreal. Hours disappearing in conversation. Eye contact that felt almost too intense to hold comfortably. Moments where silence itself felt emotionally charged. And then afterward, distance. Sometimes the next morning. Sometimes a few days later. A subtle emotional retreat. At the time, I thought, if someone feels this deeply connected to me, why do they disappear afterward? That question haunted me, because it didn't match the logic of love I had always believed in. Shouldn't closeness create more closeness? Shouldn't vulnerability strengthen connection? But emotionally avoidant dynamics don't work that way. For some people, intimacy itself becomes the trigger. The closer they feel, the more emotionally exposed they become. And exposure creates fear. Not always conscious fear, more like nervous system overload. I think that's why some of the most emotionally intense relationships become unstable right after moments of genuine connection. Not because the connection wasn't real, but because it was. And reality is harder to escape than fantasy. Fantasy allows distance, projection, control. Real intimacy requires presence, consistency, self-awareness, emotional accountability. And that level of presence can feel terrifying for someone who unconsciously relies on emotional avoidance to stay regulated. I remember one specific moment where I finally started understanding this differently. We were sitting together quietly, and there was this brief moment where he looked at me in a way I still cannot fully explain. Not romantic exactly, not casual either. It felt exposed, like he saw the depth of the connection and simultaneously feared what it required from him. That look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he pulled away emotionally almost immediately afterward. Started talking about something surface level. Shifted the energy. And I remember feeling this strange sadness in my chest. Because deep down, I think part of him knew I could see through the emotional walls he spent years building. And being seen that clearly is not always comforting. Sometimes it feels threatening, especially for people who learn to survive through emotional control. I used to think power in relationships meant dominance, confidence, certainty, emotional control. But now I think real feminine power is something quieter. It's emotional presence. The ability to remain connected to yourself while also seeing another person clearly. And that kind of presence changes people. Not through force, through reflection. Because when someone truly sees you without illusion, your defenses either soften or intensify. And in his case, I think they intensified. Not intentionally, protectively. There were moments where I could almost feel him fighting the connection internally. Not fighting me, fighting what the connection awakened inside him. His fears, his insecurities, his emotional limitations. I think part of him wanted the closeness desperately, and another part feared disappearing inside it. That contradiction is more common than people realize, especially for men who were never taught how to process deep emotional intimacy safely. Many people are taught how to pursue love. Very few are taught how to sustain emotional exposure once love actually arrives. And emotional exposure is exactly what powerful feminine energy creates. Not through manipulation, not through spiritual fantasy, through emotional honesty, through presence, through the refusal to abandon oneself in order to maintain connection. I remember apologizing for my intensity more times than I can count. Sorry if I'm too much. Sorry if I'm overthinking. Sorry if I feel deeply. And now, looking back, I feel tenderness toward that version of myself. Because she thought emotional depth was the problem, when in reality emotional depth was simply revealing what could no longer stay hidden between us. That's why these connections become so transformative. Not because they are magically perfect, but because they expose every emotional survival pattern both people carry unconsciously. And exposure changes everything. Once someone has truly seen you, really seen you, pretending becomes harder afterward. I think that's why he pulled away at times. Not because my power repelled him, but because it demanded emotional honesty from him that he wasn't fully ready to live inside consistently. And emotional honesty is exhausting for people who built their identity around emotional protection, especially when the connection begins stripping those protections away layer by layer. I remember sitting alone one night after another emotionally confusing interaction between us. Part of me still wanted to blame myself, to believe I was too emotional, too deep, too aware. But another part of me, quieter now, wiser somehow, finally whispered something different. Maybe my presence was never the problem. Maybe it simply became impossible for him to stay emotionally asleep around me. And that realization changed the way I understood the entire separation. Because suddenly, his withdrawal no longer looked like proof of my unworthiness. It looked like evidence of emotional overwhelm. Not weakness, not failure, just overwhelm. The kind that happens when someone encounters a depth of intimacy they have never learned how to sustain. And maybe that's the tragedy of some connections. Not lack of love, but lack of emotional capacity to remain open once love becomes real. Your depth was not the danger. The danger was what your presence forced him to feel about himself. The cruelest part of transformation is how lonely it feels right before clarity arrives. No one really prepares you for that part. People talk about healing like it's beautiful, empowering, liberating, and sometimes it is. But there's another side to it that almost nobody describes honestly enough. The isolation, the emotional exhaustion, the strange grief of becoming someone new while simultaneously watching parts of your old life fall away. Especially love. Especially the connections that once felt destined. I remember waking up one morning during the separation and realizing something felt different inside me. Not better, just quieter. The panic that used to greet me every morning wasn't there with the same intensity anymore. I still missed him, still thought about him, still felt the ache of the distance. But underneath the grief there was space. Tiny at first, barely noticeable, like a window crack open in a room that had been emotionally suffocating for months. And strangely, that space scared me. Because when you've lived inside emotional intensity for a long time, peace can initially feel unfamiliar, almost empty. I think that's one of the hardest parts of this journey. You spend so much time identifying with the longing, the waiting, the emotional obsession, that when those patterns begin fading, you don't immediately feel healed. You feel disoriented, like your emotional identity is dissolving. I remember sitting alone at night, staring at old messages, sometimes not to torture myself anymore, but almost out of disbelief. Disbelief that someone who once felt emotionally intertwined with me could now feel so distant. And even deeper than that, disbelief that I was slowly surviving it. That realization carried its own sadness. Because healing often means accepting realities your nervous system spent months trying to deny. And acceptance is not always comforting at first. Sometimes it feels like mourning. I think powerful women experience this stage differently than people realize. From the outside, they may look composed, functional, strong, collected, but internally there's often an entire emotional universe rearranging itself. They are grieving, detaching, rebuilding identity, learning how to exist without emotional dependency, all while still carrying memories of a connection that once felt life-altering. That's not easy, and I wish more people understood how lonely that process can feel. Especially because during transformation, your old emotional coping mechanisms stop working. You can't unknow what you've awakened to. You can't comfortably return to emotional self-abandonment once you've started reclaiming yourself. And that creates a strange in-between phase. You no longer fit inside your old patterns, but your new life hasn't fully stabilized yet either. So you exist in this emotional liminal space, half grieving, half awakening, missing them while simultaneously outgrowing the version of yourself that needed them in the same way. That contradiction is devastating sometimes. I remember crying one night not because I thought I had lost him forever, but because I realized I was losing the old version of me too. The girl who waited constantly. The girl who measured her worth through emotional closeness. The girl who felt emotionally chosen only when someone reached for her consistently. And even though those patterns hurt me, letting them go still felt painful. Because familiar pain is still familiar. And the nervous system often clings to familiarity longer than it clings to truth. There were moments during the separation where I genuinely believed I was being abandoned. Not spiritually, emotionally. It felt like being left alone in the middle of an internal transformation I never consciously agreed to begin. One part of me still wanted to run backward into the old dynamic. The late-night checking, the emotional overanalysis, the desperate hope. At least those things felt familiar. But another part of me, quieter now, was beginning to recognize something important. The separation wasn't only removing someone from my life. It was removing the emotional patterns that kept me disconnected from myself. And that realization changed the entire experience. Slowly, painfully, but permanently, I began noticing tiny things. The way music started sounding emotional again instead of triggering memories instantly. The way I could sit through silence without reaching for distraction. The way my body no longer felt constantly braced for emotional impact. Healing wasn't arriving as excitement. It was arriving as regulation. And honestly, regulation can feel boring after emotional chaos. That's another uncomfortable truth nobody talks about enough. People become addicted to emotional intensity and mistake it for love. The highs, the uncertainty, the emotional pursuit. But genuine alignment feels different, quieter, cleaner, less desperate. And when your nervous system starts adjusting to that quieter reality, can initially feel like loss. Because your body is detoxing from emotional survival mode. I think that's why so many women mistake transformation for abandonment. They interpret the collapse of old emotional structures as proof they are unloved. But often those structures are collapsing because their soul can no longer survive inside them. That's what I eventually realized about my own journey. The separation wasn't just taking him away. It was taking away every version of me that depended on external validation to feel whole. And honestly, that process hurt more than heartbreak itself. Because heartbreak eventually becomes familiar. Identity transformation does not. I remember walking outside one evening after spending days emotionally exhausted. The air felt cool, the city quieter than usual, and for the first time in months I noticed I wasn't mentally rehearsing conversations with him anymore. I wasn't imagining reunion scenarios. I wasn't trying to energetically fix the connection inside my mind. I was just walking, breathing, existing, and there was something deeply emotional about that ordinary moment. Because I realized healing had already begun quietly while I was still busy mourning. That's the strange thing about alignment. It often arrives invisibly, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through subtle nervous system changes. You stop checking your phone immediately after waking up. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop abandoning yourself emotionally every time someone becomes distant. Tiny things. But tiny things rebuild lives. I think powerful women often feel abandoned right before alignment because their old identity dissolves before the new one fully emerges. And that space in between feels unbearably lonely sometimes. You are no longer emotionally unconscious enough to return to old patterns comfortably. But you haven't fully embodied your new emotional reality either. So you float between grief and awakening, between longing and liberation, between sadness and self-respect. And during that phase, it can genuinely feel like life is taking everything away from you. But later, much later, you begin realizing something profound. Life wasn't removing love. It was removing everything that required you to shrink in order to keep it. That realization changed me. Not instantly, but deeply. I stopped viewing the separation as evidence of my unworthiness, and started seeing it as evidence that I could no longer survive inside emotionally imbalanced love without feeling the damage it caused me. That awareness hurt, but it also freed me. Because once you truly see the difference between attachment and alignment, you cannot unsee it. I still missed him. There were still nights where memories hit unexpectedly. Still moments where grief returned quietly. Healing is not linear, but underneath the sadness now, there was something else growing. Self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. Because once a woman begins trusting herself emotionally, she stops negotiating away pieces of her soul just to maintain connection. And that is usually the exact moment alignment begins. Not when the relationship returns. Not when someone apologizes. Not when closure arrives. Alignment begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself emotionally in the name of love. And strangely, that moment often looks like loneliness before it feels like freedom. Sometimes the feeling of abandonment is actually the painful space between who you were and who you are finally becoming. I didn't become powerful overnight. That's the part people misunderstand. There was no dramatic breakthrough. No cinematic moment where I suddenly woke up healed, detached, glowing, completely free from pain. It happened quietly, in tiny moments nobody else would have noticed. Moments that looked ordinary from the outside, but internally changed everything. The first time I didn't check my phone immediately after waking up. The first night I fell asleep without replaying our last conversation. The first time his silence didn't ruin my entire day. Tiny things. But healing is built from tiny things, not grand declarations. I remember sitting alone one afternoon, drinking coffee that had already gone cold beside me, and realizing something strange. I had gone almost the entire morning without thinking about whether he missed me. That thought hit me hard. Not because I stopped caring, but because caring no longer felt like survival. And for someone who spent months emotionally attached to uncertainty, that shift felt enormous. I think people assume stopping the chase means becoming cold, detached, and feeling proud. But real detachment doesn't feel hard. It feels peaceful. Not instantly peaceful, of course. At first it feels empty. Like your nervous system doesn't know where to place all the emotional energy it used to spend monitoring someone else. I remember the strange discomfort of no longer obsessing. That sounds ridiculous until you experience it yourself. Your mind has been conditioned to search constantly. What are they feeling? Why are they distant? Will they come back? Did I do something wrong? And suddenly those mental loops begin slowing down. Not because you force them to, because your nervous system becomes exhausted by emotional hypervigilance. At some point, the body simply cannot sustain that level of emotional survival forever. And when it finally starts releasing those patterns, there's grief inside that too. Because obsession becomes identity after long enough. I remember walking through a grocery store one evening when I realized music was playing overhead and I was actually listening to it. Not thinking about him while it played. Not attaching memories to lyrics. Just listening. That moment almost made me emotional. Because for months, everything had filtered through heartbreak. Songs, places, conversations, even silence. And suddenly life was starting to exist independently from the connection again. That's when I realized healing wasn't dramatic. It was sensory. Your body slowly re-enters the present moment. Food tastes normal again. Mornings stop feeling emotionally heavy. You laugh unexpectedly without guilt. Small things. But small things are evidence that the nervous system is returning to safety. I think this stage confuses many women because they expect healing to feel empowering immediately. But often it feels strangely neutral at first. Calmer, quieter, less emotionally addictive. And after intense attachment, quiet can initially feel like emptiness. I remember there were days where I almost missed the emotional chaos. Not consciously, but my body missed the intensity, the anticipation, the emotional highs and lows, the feeling of constantly feeling something. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I had become chemically attached to emotional unpredictability, not love itself. Uncertainty. And uncertainty creates obsession, because the nervous system keeps chasing resolution. Will they stay? Will they leave? Will they text? Will they return emotionally? That constant unpredictability traps the mind inside emotional pursuit. But once the pursuit stops, clarity begins entering the space obsession used to occupy. And clarity changes everything. I remember one particular night lying in bed in complete silence. No music, no scrolling, no trying to distract myself emotionally, just silence. Months earlier, that silence would have terrified me. It would have immediately triggered longing, anxiety, emotional spiraling. But that night felt different. Not happy, not sad, just still. And inside that stillness, I realized something profound. I was finally starting to return to myself. Not the wounded version of myself desperate to be chosen. Not the emotionally exhausted version trying to maintain connection at all costs. Myself, the version that existed before fear took over my nervous system. And honestly, reconnecting with her felt unfamiliar at first. I had spent so long emotionally focused outward that I forgot what my own energy felt like when it wasn't consumed by attachment. That realization hit me harder than the breakup itself, because I understood how much of my emotional life had slowly revolved around waiting. Waiting for reassurance, waiting for consistency, waiting for emotional clarity. And waiting is exhausting, especially for women who mistake emotional endurance for love. I used to think loyalty meant staying emotionally available no matter how inconsistent someone became. Now I see it differently. Real love should not require you to abandon your own nervous system to sustain it. That realization changed the way I understood everything, especially myself. I started noticing subtle emotional changes that no one else could see. I became less reactive, not emotionally numb, just less destabilized by uncertainty. His silence no longer felt like proof of my unworthiness. His distance no longer triggered panic immediately. And maybe the biggest shift of all, I stopped trying to control the outcome. That was terrifying at first, because attachment creates the illusion that if you analyze enough, love enough, wait enough, you can prevent loss. But eventually, healing teaches you something deeper. Control is not connection, and emotional chasing is not intimacy. I remember the exact moment I realized the obsession had finally loosened its grip on me. I was talking to someone about my life, my future, my goals, and for almost an entire conversation, I forgot to mentally connect everything back to him. That sounds small, but for someone whose inner world had revolved around emotional attachment for so long, it felt revolutionary. I was becoming emotionally present in my own life again, not living inside imagined conversations, not trapped inside emotional projections. Present. And presence changes your energy in ways people immediately feel. I think that's why dynamics shift so dramatically when the feminine stops chasing. Not because she becomes manipulative, because her energy returns to herself. She stops leaking emotional attention constantly outward. And when that happens, the entire dynamic reorganizes. I noticed people responding to me differently during this phase. Not because I changed my appearance, but because my nervous system changed. There was less desperation in my energy, less unconscious seeking, less emotional grasping. And strangely, I became more magnetic once I stopped trying to be emotionally chosen. That's the paradox nobody explains properly. The more you chase love emotionally, the more disconnected you become from your own center. But the moment you return to yourself fully, your energy changes naturally. Not performatively, authentically. I think that's what true feminine power actually is. Not control over others. control over your own emotional abandonment patterns. The ability to remain connected to yourself even when someone else becomes distant. That changes everything. I remember one evening catching my reflection in a window while walking home. And for a split second, I saw something different in my eyes. Not sadness, not longing, peace, quiet peace. And it almost shocked me, because I had spent so much time believing healing would arrive as intensity, some huge emotional breakthrough. But instead it arrived softly, like my soul slowly unclenching after months of emotional tension. That's when I understood something I wish more women realized sooner. The moment you stop chasing isn't the moment you stop loving. It's the moment love stops feeling like fear. And once that happens, you can never fully return to the old emotional version of yourself again. Because now you know what emotional self-abandonment costs. You know what obsession feels like in the body. You know how exhausting it is to build your identity around someone else's emotional availability. And once you truly see that clearly, something inside you refuses to keep living that way. Even if part of you still misses them. Even if memories still hurt sometimes. Because underneath the grief now, there's self-respect. And self-respect changes the emotional landscape permanently. I still thought about him. Still missed certain moments. Still carried tenderness for what we shared. But I was no longer disappearing inside the connection. And that more than anything else was the real transformation. The moment you stop chasing is the moment your energy finally comes home to you. For a long time, I carried a quiet fear that maybe I was simply too much to stay loved. Too emotional, too deep, too intense, too aware. I never said those words out loud often, but internally they shape everything. Every time someone pulled away emotionally, I immediately searched myself for the reason. Maybe I cared too much. Maybe I felt too deeply. Maybe my vulnerability overwhelmed people. And when this connection began unraveling, those fears became even louder. Because nothing hurts quite like being deeply felt by someone and still watching them drift away. It creates a very specific kind of self-doubt. The kind that doesn't just break your heart. It makes you question your nature. I remember sitting alone one night after reading old messages, trying to understand how something that once felt so emotionally alive could suddenly feel unreachable. And the hardest part wasn't even the distance. It was the story I began telling myself because of the distance. If I were softer, maybe he would have stayed. If I were easier to handle emotionally, maybe things would be different. If I needed less, maybe I would have been loved more consistently. That inner dialogue is brutal, especially for women who have spent years learning to equate emotional self-erasure with love. But slowly, painfully, something inside me began waking up. Not dramatically, quietly, through observation, through reflection, through finally becoming honest about what this connection had actually revealed. And what it revealed was not that I was too much. It revealed that I had finally stopped shrinking. That's different. Completely different. I think many women confuse rejection with incompatibility of emotional capacity. Someone pulling away does not automatically mean you were wrong for being deep. Sometimes it means your depth required emotional honesty they were not ready to sustain. And emotional honesty is terrifying for people who survive through emotional avoidance. I understand that now in a way I couldn't before. Because when someone truly sees you, really sees you, there are only two options: expansion or retreat. And not everyone chooses expansion. Some people choose distance because distance feels safer than transformation. I remember how hard it was to accept that. Part of me wanted a cleaner explanation. Something simple. He didn't care enough. It was all fake. He was emotionally unavailable. But the truth felt more complicated than that. I think he cared deeply. I think the connection was real. I think he genuinely felt things he didn't fully know how to carry. And maybe that's what made the separation so painful. Not the absence of feeling, the presence of feeling without emotional readiness. That combination destroys people quietly, especially when both individuals sense the depth of the connection, but only one person is truly prepared to face what the connection demands internally. Because connections like this demand something enormous from both people. Self-awareness, emotional accountability, the willingness to stop hiding behind survival patterns. And not everyone is prepared for that level of exposure. I know now that my presence confronted things in him. Not intentionally, not manipulatively, just naturally. My growth reflected his stagnation. My emotional openness reflected his avoidance. My self-awareness reflected the parts of himself he still struggled to face honestly. And reflections become uncomfortable when someone is still emotionally attached to who they used to be. That's why powerful feminine energy can feel destabilizing. Not because it is aggressive, because it is revealing. It exposes emotional truth. I remember one specific moment where this realization fully landed inside me. I was sitting quietly one evening, thinking about all the times I had apologized for my depth, for caring deeply, for asking emotionally honest questions, for wanting real connection instead of surface-level comfort. And suddenly I felt this overwhelming sadness, not toward him, toward myself. Because I realized how many years I had spent believing my emotional depth was something that needed to be managed carefully so people wouldn't leave. That realization broke my heart more than the separation ever did. The understanding that I had unconsciously trained myself to become smaller in order to feel emotionally safe. Smaller emotionally, smaller energetically, smaller relationally. And this connection shattered that pattern completely, painfully, but permanently. Because once you experience what it feels like to stop abandoning yourself emotionally, you cannot fully return to pretending. Even if loneliness tempts you, even if grief tempts you, even if part of you still misses the familiarity of old dynamics, something inside you has already awakened. I think that's why these journeys change women so deeply. Not because they are magical, but because they force confrontation with every emotional survival pattern you've ever used to maintain love. People think awakening is about becoming spiritually enlightened. Sometimes awakening is much simpler than that. Sometimes it's finally realizing, I should not have to disappear emotionally in order to be loved consistently. That realization changes everything. I remember how strange it felt the first time I stopped blaming myself for his withdrawal. Not angrily, not defensively, just honestly. I stopped interpreting his distance as proof that I was unlovable, and started understanding it as proof that emotional intimacy was activating fears he hadn't fully learned to navigate. That shift brought compassion into the story. Not self-blame, not bitterness, compassion. Because the truth is many people want deep love until deep love begins exposing them, until it asks them to evolve, until it removes their emotional armor, until it demands consistency instead of emotional control. That's when fear enters, and fear often disguises itself as withdrawal, silence, confusion, distance. I think part of him genuinely loved the connection, but another part feared what the connection required from him internally. And both things can exist simultaneously. That's what makes these experiences so emotionally complex. Love alone is not always enough to sustain transformation. Emotional capacity matters too. And no one wants to hear that when they are heartbroken, because heartbreak searches for certainty, simple answers. But healing eventually teaches you to hold complexity instead, to understand that someone can love you and still not be emotionally ready to remain open inside the relationship consistently. That realization hurt me deeply, but it also freed me because it allowed me to stop turning his limitations into evidence against my worth. That's the trap so many women fall into. Someone withdraws and immediately they begin editing themselves internally. Too emotional, too needy, too intense, too complicated. But depth is not dysfunction. Emotional awareness is not weakness. And needing real intimacy is not asking for too much. I wish more women understood that, especially the women who feel ashamed for how deeply they love. Your capacity to feel deeply is not the curse. The curse is believing you must suppress your depth to remain lovable. And once you stop believing that, everything changes. Your standards change. Your energy changes. Your relationship to yourself changes. You stop begging to be emotionally chosen by people who are frightened by authentic intimacy. You stop negotiating your self-worth against someone else's emotional limitations. And most importantly, you stop apologizing for the very qualities that make your love transformative. I still think about him sometimes. Certain memories still carry tenderness. Healing does not erase emotional truth. But now, when I think about the connection, I no longer see myself as too much. I see myself as someone who finally became emotionally visible. And visibility changes relationships. Because once you stop shrinking, people can no longer love the edited version of you. They must either meet your truth or retreat from it. And maybe that's the final lesson in all of this. He didn't leave because you were too much. He left because your presence made emotional hiding impossible. And not everyone is ready for that kind of love. But the right person will be. The right connection will not require you to become smaller to maintain harmony. It will not punish your depth. It will not fear your evolution. It will rise to meet you there. And until that love arrives, promise yourself something. Do not abandon your power just because someone else was frightened by it. Because your awakening was never the tragedy. Pretending to be less than you are would have been. You were never too much. You simply became impossible to love unconsciously.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.